Malcolm Little, better known to most as Malcolm X, was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska. He was only one of 8 children in his family and the son of Earl Little. Earl was a Baptist preacher who was interested in the subject of racial separatism. Because of Earl's outspoken personality, he became a target for white supremacists. The Littles had to move multiple times due to the death threats they received, and their house was even burned down in 1929. Unfortunately, Earl Little was killed in 1931, police claiming that it was either a suicide or accident. The Littles, however, knew that this was the work of white supremacists. Soon after, Malcolm's mom was placed in a mental hospital, struggling to cope with the loss of her husband. Malcolm then lived in several foster homes in Michigan before moving to New York with his older sister. During high school, Malcolm X fell apart and eventually dropped out. He was getting involved with gangs, violence, gambling, and drugs. This was very contrasting to his middle school years, where he was an excellent student. He was arrested in 1946 and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison because of robbery. While in jail, he became fascinated with the Nation of Islam, a group of African American Muslims who promoted black nationalism and played a major role in the civil rights movement. He also used his time as an opportunity to educate himself. When he was released, he quickly joined the Nation of Islam. He rose up through the nation, soon becoming the minister of New York Mosque No. 7, the largest group of Muslims in the country. He was a fantastic public speaker, something that he'd picked up on in prison. In 1953, he changed his name to Malcolm X, discarding the last name Little, a name that had been given to his family from slave owners. He chose the last name X to represent the last name of his ancient tribal ancestors, which he would never know. As the 1950s progressed, Malcolm rose in power even more, becoming a national voice, inspiring African Americans, and scaring many racist white people. When President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Malcolm X went too far, claiming that Kennedy's death was just like chickens coming home to roost. By saying this, he was implying that the president's death was because of something he had done previously in his life. The Nation of Islam suspended him from the organization for saying this, and he took a pilgrimage to Mecca to see the origins of Islam and Islamic teachings. During his time there, he began to embrace Orthodox Islamic beliefs and returned to the United States with a new attitude and a new name, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. He left the Nation of Islam, and his beliefs transformed into the more traditional ideas that people such as Martin Luther King Jr. preached. He wanted to abolish all racism and stop looking at white people as the enemy, instead saying that racism, not white people, is the biggest fear for blacks. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm was giving a talk in the Audubon Ballroom in New York City when 3 members of the Nation of Islam stood up and shot him. Doctors did their best to save him as he was rushed to the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital across the street, where my grandfather was working at the time. The doctors did their best to save him, but ultimately failed as he passed away. Although Malcolm X was a very controversial figure during his lifespan, he left a big impact on the United States, extending much after his time. He inspired many people to change and fight racism, and is celebrated today as one of the most influential civil rights leaders of all time. I have my grandfather here today to talk and answer questions about this event. All right. So why were you in New York at the time of this assassination?
I was a medical student at the time at Columbia University in the College of Physicians and Surgeons. It was my senior year, and I was on a rotation that had me close to the emergency department at the time of the event.
What was it like to be in a hospital with Malcolm X?
Well, you can imagine the scene, and this was a very large audience across the street at the Audubon Ballroom. People had a lot of anticipation and excitement about his coming talk. And of course, the violence of the shooting was enough to create a lot of confusion and chaos and alarm. And that all swept in the hospital door with him.
Yeah.
In fact, there were so many people hovering around him that it made it very hard to move the stretcher that he was on. the emergency room surgery at the time was upstairs from the main floor of the hospital. And so it was necessary to move him on the stretcher into the elevator and upstairs. And the mob was so crowded and so agitated that they had great difficulty in actually getting him in and getting the elevator door closed to take him up to the surgery.
Yeah. As we know, Malcolm X was a very controversial person. What are your thoughts about him and what he stood for?
Well, that's a very good question. I would say he was controversial because of the very strong views he took early in his career, advocating violent action if necessary to basically overthrow white society in order to provide equality and equal opportunity for blacks. African Americans, as the term was at that time. Later in his career, he, as I think you describe in your background, after performing the Hajj and converting to a more enlightened form, I would say, of Islam, his views moderated quite a lot. Overall, in both phases, he was dealing with a very serious national problem that remains a serious problem today. Racism, and in particular victimization of African Americans in the United States. I think the overall balance was that his impact was very important, it was very prominent, and in the end, very positive.
What effects did this have on relatives and people you know, as well as the general public?
I think there was mainly a sense of shock that this event had occurred. I'm sure there are some in the general public who had already developed fear and a deep dislike of Malcolm X, that maybe he had it coming. One of the ironies in this is that it was members of the Nation of Islam who were responsible for his death, when he had been a very powerful figure in the growth of that movement before he became more moderate in his views. So I'm sure there was a mixture of feelings among the public, but shock on everybody's part.
Yeah. How closely did you follow the news coverage about this after it happened?
Well, in the immediate aftermath, I was, well aware of the public discussion that took place, and it has been of interest to see how, as you mentioned, his story played out after his death. Increasing recognition of the overall balance of the importance of what he did to call attention to racial problems in the United States.
Yeah. Did anyone else you know have any connection to the assassination?
Not that I know of, no.
All right. What did you think about Malcolm X's transformation from before the pilgrimage he took to after? And which version of him did you like better?
Well, I think to most people among white society, he became, if not likable, at least more appreciated and perhaps more recognized as a more valuable contributor to this issue than before. I think his militancy in the early stage of his career was a serious problem for many people.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for your time.
Well, you're very welcome. My pleasure.